Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives.
My name is Rick Strassman, and before I get started, I'd like to thank Psyched 2020, the organizers and sponsors. Tip my hat to their hard work. So the title of my short lecture is Psychedelics, Panacea, Placebo, or Too Good to Be True. One of the reasons I studied DMT was to determine if it possessed inherent spiritual properties. That is, would the pure pharmacology of the drug cause spiritual experiences? In order to study this, we minimized set and setting issues, or at least we directed them toward a different goal than a therapeutic or spiritual one. Volunteers were not patients, and they participated primarily out of altruism and curiosity, rather than to have any particular type of experience, or later on to feel less depressed or meditate better. In addition, the preparation we gave was bare bones. The drug starts quickly, is over fast, and you may think that you've died. And the technical advice that we offered was pretty simple. Relax into the rush, keep your wits about you, and if any medical problems arise, you're in good hands in the hospital. The main task was to bring back descriptions of what they had just gone through. With those kinds of set and setting parameters, people basically had trips that corresponded perfectly with who they were. A nurse with a long-term interest in the near-death state had an NDE. A physician who was a religious studies major in college had a mystical experience. A software designer saw the origination of information and bits coming out of a white room. A nihilistic and cynical artist became even more so. Two people struggling with depression had a brief relapse. A psychic brought healing to the spirit world, and so on. The specific nature of their experiences corresponded exactly to what they brought to the study, not to any specific effects of the drug, but to more general, amplifying, clarifying ones, making certain things more real or true than they were before. But they were there before. The drug did not cause those things, those feelings or ideas to emerge from out of the blue. Now, everywhere we read about the benefits of psychedelic drugs, specific benefits, quite specific ones, not general effects. I think our DMT results can shed some light on how specific effects result from more fundamental, general ones. How can one class of drugs affect such a vast array of conditions and modify so many personal characteristics? They appear to benefit OCD, eating and substance abuse disorders, reduce depression and end-of-life despair, reduce spousal violence and prisoner recidivism, enhance creativity, spirituality, and nature appreciation, make you more open, improve your meditation. There seems to be a new benefit published nearly every month. It's as if they are panaceas. They do everything. A psychedelic drug does what you want it to, because you want it to, and you believe it will. Panaceas work through placebo effect. They don't directly modify biology like an antibiotic kills bacteria, but indirectly through some kind of interaction between the mind and one's innate healing mechanisms. In the antibiotic example, they increase one's own infection-fighting abilities. Placebo effects are thus biological, objective, and measurable. You can reverse placebo analgesia using an endorphin blocker. In this case, placebo pain relief is mediated by endorphins. There are also immune, hormonal, brain activity changes mediating the placebo response. Psychotherapy, in a way, is a placebo, since effective psychotherapy has the same brain effects as Prozac. Placebos and psychedelics both share certain features. They both are sensitive to set and setting issues. For the placebo effect, it's the medical environment, faith in a confident, optimistic practitioner, hopes and expectations all steer the effect. For psychedelics, we call these same factors the set and the setting, what the person brings to the experience and the external environment in which it takes place, both interpersonal and physical. There are already data indicating a relationship between psychedelics and suggestibility. Psychedelic drugs enhance suggestibility, and hypnosis intensifies LSD's effects. So psychedelic compounds enhance suggestibility, and hypnosis intensifies the effects of psychedelic drugs. In other words, you can increase the effect of LSD through suggestion, and you can increase suggestibility with LSD. The use of LSD by Charles Manson and his followers is a case in point. They all had certain beliefs and tendencies that were now actualized through LSD use in a specific setting. These factors were organized in the direction of more malignant ends, which were then accomplished, which weren't possible before. The result of any psychedelic experience depends on what the drug is working on. This explains why they were never good brainwashing tools. The seed of the desired outcome has to be there in the first place. Fertilizing watermelon doesn't result in tomatoes, just larger watermelons. No one in Manson's group became a monk, and no one in research nowadays becomes a serial killer. You can't turn someone into an assassin or an enlightened being unless that's part of who they are or wish to be. So here we are dealing with the mechanisms of how psychedelics work, which may be as super placebos. In this case, the beneficial effects of attaining specific states of consciousness, like those resembling mystical experience or ego dissolution, may simply indicate that the placebo effect has been set into motion. There may be a whole variety of other states that are just as beneficial if they cross a certain threshold of required criteria and intensity, a sense of truth and reality being one of the most important. For example, in the 1950s in Saskatchewan, where the model was that LSD-induced effects were like delirium tremens, the DTs, then producing temporary DTs with LSD in alcoholics did turn out to be beneficial. What this suggests is that psychedelics could be incredibly useful tools for understanding how body and mind interact. Certain subjective effects result in certain biological and psychological consequences, a process that occurs totally out of consciousness, something we are completely unaware of taking place. There are also clinical consequences besides theoretical ones. Anything that enhances the placebo response will be greatly useful in clinical medicine, especially in conditions where placebo response is pronounced, such as in depression, pain, irritable bowel syndromes. As a side note, it's less likely that conditions that do not respond robustly to placebo, for example, cancer, might be less responsive to psychedelic drug-assisted treatment. An interesting part of the puzzle has been revealed in some studies from the University of Michigan last year, John Dean and Jimo Borjigin's lab, found that rodent brain synthesizes DMT in concentrations similar to those of well-known neurotransmitters like serotonin. What this suggests is that there may be a DMT neurotransmitter system in the brain. What would the function of a DMT neurotransmitter system be? In the case of serotonin, that transmitter system regulates mood and visual perception. Dopamine regulates pleasure, noradrenaline mediates activation. What is the hallmark of the DMT experience? A feeling that what one is beholding is more real than real. Perhaps then the DMT system regulates our sense of reality. Thus, activation or inhibition of the DMT neurotransmitter system may play a role in endogenous placebo activity. That is, how true and real are one's beliefs and perceptions. In a way, this lends some support to the New Age notion that we create our own reality. That is, if certain experiences or thoughts are associated with higher levels of endogenous DMT activity, do these become the benchmarks, the guiding lights that define our lives? The idea that we are living in a DMT hallucination isn't new, but there are two questions that I think of in that case. How would we ever know? And more important, in the meantime, does it affect how we act and what we believe? Cause and effect still seem to be operative. We have a sense of free will, and there is still a creator and sustainer of the universe. So I don't think we would act or believe any differently. Tied into these ideas is that of integration. If we are in a constant DMT hallucination, then integration is happening all the time. In a more customary sense, though, integration refers to the previous or the past psychedelic experience. In other words, what do we do with what just happened? Much of the current focus is on using mindfulness, a Buddhist meditation practice which comes from the Buddhist religion. One is mindful of ongoing physical and mental experience, notes them and disengages with them. Using mindfulness in this way is based on the assumption that most psychedelic experiences are nonverbal, mystical, unitive, the white light, and mindfulness can recreate certain features of that state voluntarily. In some ways, it's the psychedelic psychedelic experience minus the steroids. On the other hand, most psychedelic experiences are not like that. Instead, they're interactive and relational, especially with DMT. That space is full of things, beings, information, imagery, interactions, feelings, so on. The paradigmatic Western spiritual experience is prophecy, as laid out in the Hebrew Bible, the foundational text of Judaism, and thus of Christianity, and to a lesser extent of Islam. By prophetic experience, I mean any spiritual experience as described in the text, not only those that involve predicting. Instead of a state of consciousness being the ultimate goal, it is to receive and communicate verbal information contained and extracted from that state regarding the nature of our relationships with the spiritual and physical worlds. It is highly verbal, and for that reason may provide a useful counterpoint to the nonverbal mindful state. That is, if you want to approach a more prophetic experience-like state, then study and prayer, not mindfulness, are the methods suggested within the Judaic tradition. In any event, integration is played out in your life. There are at least two ways to approach this, and they overlap much more than they differ. These are the emotional and the intellectual or cognitive aspects. Gravitate toward what reminds you of the best you felt in the psychedelic state. If studying, doing, practicing, or relating in some way or another to certain people or things recreates that feeling, then you know you're integrating your psychedelic experiences into your life. You're using your psychedelic experiences as guiding lights, as feedback regarding the direction your life is taking. Now for the last part of the title of my talk, Too Good to Be True. If something looks too good to be true, it's not true. We all know that. So one of the ways to avoid media, public, or government backlash to psychedelics increasing availability and use is not to overreach regarding the effects of psychedelic drugs, not to glorify their benefits, ignore their adverse effects. And also, it's important to maintain a healthy dose of caution regarding any new and powerful tool. They are not to be taken casually, nor is it advisable to make casual claims about what they do. They are value-neutral tools that may be used for great good or for great evil, depending on how they are used and by whom. So let's take a moment break, get the video off, and I will take some questions. So thanks very much. Thanks for paying attention.
All right, we're just going to get Rick on the phone. Give us 2 seconds and promote him to a panelist.
Hello.
Hey, Rick, how are you?
Good. What about you?
I am doing well as well. So I'm broadcasting your audio right now. You're welcome to turn on the video on Zoom. We promoted you to a panelist.
Okay. Oh, there I am. Great.
Yep, beautiful. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time. Really incredible stuff and video. So thank you for sharing that. I'd love to, just kind of jump right into questions and would love to have you talk to us a little bit first about kind of reaffirming what is already there inside of the individual. This is something that I think a lot of therapists, practitioners, even researchers don't necessarily talk as much about. Most individuals say, you bring someone into a session, you have a specific goal that you're trying to get them to, whether that's a better mental state, the reduction of depression, alcohol use disorder, whatever that is, the reduction of an ailment, and then they come out better on the other side. But what it seems that you're pointing to is really, oftentimes we're reaffirming what's already inside that person. So could you share a little bit more about that and the different pieces there and some of your thoughts and how they might be different than what other individuals in the space have been promoting for the last decade?
Yeah, I think that's a key issue. I mean, that's basically the major point I was trying to make in the lecture. When I talk about the pre-existing goals, personalities, aspirations, beliefs in the individual before the drug session and upon which the drug is working, I qualify pre-existing by saying more or less conscious, pre-existing personality traits. So by the notion of more or less conscious, we're needing to walk into psychology and the idea of the unconscious, that certain things which motivate us are unconscious. All of us do things that we have no idea why we do, and that can be potentially harmful or helpful. Usually, they're harmful because they're unconscious and we won't face them. And so one of the ideas of psychoanalytic psychotherapy is to bring the unconscious into consciousness through symbols like dreams, slips of the tongue, those kinds of unconscious behaviors ones that we aren't really aware of where they come from. Yeah, so, case in point, I was reading an interview with one of the premier psychedelic psychotherapists out there, and he pointed to the to his finding that some agnostics, after they had a big psilocybin trip, started believing in God. And so his point was, so it couldn't possibly be the result of suggestion because they didn't believe in God in the first place. But that's ignoring the existence of the unconscious, or even the preconscious, what you're barely aware of, but certainly not the unconscious. So in your unconscious, you may be an agnostic or even an atheist because of some traumatic event, and that's the reason it isn't in your mind. You're not aware of it. But through the effects of the psychedelic drug, the unconscious becomes conscious. That's one of the placebo effects, I think, is to make things more visible. You're more aware of them. They're more true. They're in your field of vision. So discussions about the set of the person who's undergoing a drug session needs to include the idea of unconscious beliefs and aspirations.
Mm-hmm. And how do we, pull those out of an individual, I guess? Is that done through, qualitative research, filling out surveys? Is there a way for us to pull those things out even before we actually get into a psychedelic session? Is it by using some of the tools you described, such as, hypnosis, meditation, suggestibility, things like that?
Well, if you're sticking with some more classical ways of understanding what's unconscious or what are unconscious impulses or conflicts, there are some psychological tests, like the Rorschach, the Inslot test. It's not great, but it'll give you an idea of certain things that may or may not be true, and then you can go back and confirm or refute them. There are personality inventories that are psychoanalytic in nature and could tap into things. Hypnotizing people, you can get an unconscious material sometimes, things which have been forgotten or repressed. So there are tools to access unconscious mental material.
Mm-hmm. So the context of Charles Manson and his crew of individuals, it was something that you brought up in your talk. The individuals who were affected by his, in many ways, malicious methodologies, were those individuals who you believe were more predisposed to, be able to, commit murder, for instance, and in some of their cases have psychotic breaks, if we want to talk about it that way. And basically he was really great at identifying individuals who might be more willing to step into that, inviting them in and actually taking them through the process to get to that end goal.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened. The Manson followers, were psychopaths. They're criminals. That had an axe to grind against the larger society, or they just didn't have any idea who they were. So Manson gave LSD to these folks, and he would take small doses as well at the same time. And part of it was to establish a very close relationship among all of the group. but the other, was this, this worldview of helter-skelter, which would be a huge race war between whites and blacks. The blacks would win, and then, Manson and his group would become the government, the rulers of, this new society. So that's the worldview that was instilled in these people in a fertile, fertile ground. They were poor, they were angry, they wanted to get revenge. They were violent already, many of them. So it was a different way, or for a different reason, to use the truth enhancing, meaning enhancing properties of LSD.
Mm-hmm. We have so much more media today, and so many more places to access information, which initially you might think would dull people's propensity to step into conspiracies and these types of manipulations and kind of these cult-like mentalities. But it seems like that's not really the case. It seems like some of those things are being actually more emphasized, and especially as psychedelics enter the mainstream, that's something that has the potential to grow. I'd love to hear your thoughts on, over the next 10 to 20 years, should we be expecting to see more of these Charles Manson type of characters and their associated communities, or should we actually see a diminishment of that because we just have more information available to us?
Well, I think with increased availability and a more casual approach, to their effect, that psychedelics will be taken by a lot more people. In a way, it's a flashback to the '60s. Everybody began with a really optimistic point of view, and it was a small group of people. And then Leary popularized the drug, and everybody took them. That wouldn't have been the case. And, there were adverse effects. There were creeps giving them to people for horrible reasons. One of my high school friends, track team mate, took LSD one day, was on a high floor in a Las Vegas apartment, and, decided to see if he could fly. Jumped out the window and he died. So that is, I think, there's information out there about how to minimize adverse effects, but you can't abolish them. You can't avoid them. Unstable people will take psychedelics by themselves. Suicidal people will take LSD by themselves, or psilocybin. So I think we need to be prepared, and I think we need, to have answers ready for those eventualities. There was a suicide at the Hopkin study with the terminally ill, and this was in a patient that got a very, very, very tiny dose of psilocybin, completely non-psychoactive. But she killed herself, and we know very little about that case. And I think those kinds of cases ought to be discussed. What happened, and is it failure of the model, where there's some staff problems? What took place there? Because there are going to be adverse effects, and if somebody is going through the literature and stumbles on this case that's suicide, they're going to say, why didn't you tell us about that, or why didn't we ever talk about that? And I think the same thing will be the case with non-research use in the field, as people are experimenting, for good reasons. They want to be happier, more creative, more spiritual, experience more pleasure. So we need to be prepared for public health consequences, which were really not reacted to that well by the research community in an explanatory way when they started causing public health concerns. at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s.
Mm-hmm. At the time, are you aware of any sort of, I guess, rules around the consumption of these substances? Like today, you might give a friend, a psychedelic dose and say, really make sure that you're paying attention to set and setting, who you're surrounded by, things like that. Were there those kind of go-to rules back then as well? Yeah, I would just love to hear.
Well, they weren't, they weren't articulated as such. There was really, no place you could go to find that information. But still, it became common knowledge among people who tripped. For example, I was going over my college diary, and the first time I took LSD, my friend said, "Be careful. I'll keep an eye on you. If anything goes wrong or you feel weird, come and talk to me." So it was well known that you needed to be safe and supported, but there weren't any manuals. Well, that's not entirely true. There was one manual, the Psychedelic Book of the Dead by Leary, Alfred, and Metzner. But it was completely far out. I mean, it was all about the Bargos, as opposed to stay on the first floor of the dorm. Don't walk off without telling somebody.
Definitely. Yeah. What do you feel like are some of the things that we can be doing today to prepare ourselves, as you say, for a future that might, expose many of the dark sides of what these psychedelics bring to humanity?
Well, I think the spokesman ought to be responsible in what they say, which is to treat potential or real concern, real problems with the same care and attention as speaking about the positive effects. So we don't need any Pied Pipers. Anybody who rushes to be a Pied Piper ought to be censured at least or ignored. We don't need Pied Pipers talking about religious things. Like the experts, the research scientists. They want to stay within what's known as objective, which doesn't freak anybody out. We don't need non-professional Pied Pipers, and the spokesman need to be level-headed about both the good and the bad. Because there's going to be questions. Let's say there's like a suicide on psilocybin, and they're going to want to talk to the expert. What do you know about psilocybin? And were there any suicides, or how could it make somebody suicidal? So it's important to get that stuff thought out in advance and keep it transparent.
Definitely. Do you feel like there are some organizations in this space that are doing a really good job in regards to basically, intentionally focusing on making sure that, I guess, the past doesn't repeat itself? Of course, there's research organizations, like these research centers, like Johns Hopkins and MAPS, but are there any other organizations that that are doing, I guess, the work today to be able to introduce harm reduction and safety going into the future?
I'm just not plugged into that level.
Mm-hmm.
Of activity.
Definitely.
The organizations I'm mostly aware of are the research organizations.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And the Pied Pipers, as we're seeing them, many of them have hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth. They're very powerful individuals getting into this space. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on, individuals who have mass amounts of power, maybe more so than Timothy Leary ever did, going in and trying to push for-profit agendas, trying to grow their specific company through proselytization of these compounds on the masses, things like that. Do you have any thoughts on how we as a community can defend all of these dark futures from happening, in regards to the entities in power who are trying to push for a future that's, you know, coming much faster than we might need it to?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a deep question. Yeah, it's, you know, like how do you keep the world from turning into the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch? You know, there's 2D and there's some other, you know, drugs which are completely mind screwing with, and everybody's, you know, taking them for various reasons, and you know the whole world is, you know, descending into this commercialized psychedelic health. Well, you know, my Zen, you know, teacher used to say it's 51% good, 49% bad, and you know that's the reason each of us needs to do everything we can within our power to balance in the direction of the good. You know, so each of us has got our own strengths. I mean, some people can teach, some people can think, some people are organizers. You know, and you know, education is key. You know, you need to let people know what the good and the, you know, bad you know, aspects of these, you know, drugs are. You want to train people, you know, to be discerning. You know, but it's a huge battle. It's the black versus the white. It's, you know, light versus the dark. It's the good versus the bad. That's kind of an ongoing struggle.
Definitely. One of the things that you talked about was, you know, this idea of us being in kind of a DMT reality as a simulation, possibly, and, you know, what are the consequences of that? Well, you know, there might not necessarily be consequences in regards to our actions. Could you describe, you know, models, or I guess certain variables of models where we would see, you know, significant changes in human behavior? Some of the things you mentioned were free will, things like that, you know, changing, but would love to hear perspectives on just kind of alternative ways of being and what types of models might actually change the ways that we act.
Well, I don't think humans are going to change in their current iteration. I think that's just going to stay the same in tribalism and greed, hate, and delusion. You know, I think it's going to take you know, genetic engineering, and I think we're going to need, you know, to modify the human organism. You know, for example, you know, to secrete, you know, more oxytocin, for example. I mean, you could, you know, genetically engineer the species to, you know, be more compassionate, more bonding. But I think with our current, you know, hardware and the software, I don't think it's going to happen. You know, there was a, you know, great book that came out in the 40s by Olaf Stapledon called First and Last Men, and it's a, you know, chronicle of, you know, 2 billion years of human evolution and, you know, 19 species of man. And you know, this is the first species. Ours is the first, you know, species, and it goes through 18 more iterations. And it's all through genetic engineering. You know, all you know, that you try this and you try that, and you know, depending on, you know, the results, you know, try over again, try again.
Definitely. That's sorry.
Well, you know, the you know, psychedelics, I think, can play a role in genetic engineering. You know, for example, you know, one of the points I make in my lecture on is the idea of a DMT neurotransmitter system, the transmitter system, you know, which is implied by the data coming out of the Ann Arbor group. You know, so could you genetically engineer people to produce more DMT or less DMT? You know, what kind of, you know, people would they be? Would they be more spiritual, or you know, would they all be crazy? You know, so you know, the activation of, you know, brain centers is being, you know, worked out with response, you know, to the psychedelic. You know, so could you engineer parts of the brain to be, you know, more responsive, or, you know, the receptors, you know, to being more responsive, you know, normally, under normal conditions, or, make them, or, you know, perturb them, you know, more easily, you know, through intervention I think that psychedelic physiology, as it were, could influence the direction taken by genetic engineering to improve the chances of our species survival.
Definitely, yeah. That idea of, I guess, genetically engineering ourselves to have more oxytocin, being able to be pulled towards one another. Extremely unique and interesting. How we have certain genetic engineering technologies. I think I was just reading an article on 3 individuals benefiting from CRISPR a couple days ago. How far do you see this future out? Is this something that we can expect on a 10-year time horizon, 15, 20, more than that, when we start seeing kind of these larger changes? And also, do you feel like this is something that's going to be pushed for by government, by communities, by kind of for-profit, motivated individuals? Where do you think that push is going to be coming from first?
Well, in that book, First and Last Men by Stapleton, it takes 2 billion years to get to the 19th species, and the 19th species live on Neptune, and they're very tall because of gravity, like 60 feet tall.
Wow. Okay.
People live 35,000 years, because that's the amount of time that it takes to accumulate all available knowledge, and the species is able to tap into a communal mind across the planet all at the same time and experience incredible ecstasy and communion. So that's the ideal scenario, right? Paradise, 35,000 years. So I think those kinds of advances are going to take a long time. And Stapleton's timeline is 2 billion years. I don't know if we have got that much time, but if there's intervening species that can hang in there until then, it might work out. But I don't know. I'm not that current on the technology being developed for genetic engineering. So I'm not sure how quickly it'll come to pass. I can't imagine that kind of longevity being induced anytime soon. And there's going to be competing interests. So like in response to your other question, we just need to do everything we can to steer us in the right direction.
What do you feel like is some of the most important research for people to be reading today? What are some of the studies that you've seen or you think that are going to really have the most impact on how all of this unfolds?
Well, that's a good question, because I review scientific manuscripts. That's one of my side jobs. Somebody submits a research paper to a journal, the editor sends me the manuscript after I would like to review it, and I do that maybe every 3 months or so. So I stay pretty current on what's being published out there and what's being done. It's high quality science. There's no question about that, but it's not especially creative. It's more like repeating what we did in the 60s with greater precision and certitude. So I think I would like to see, although I have not yet seen some cogent studies refuting or at least challenging the mystical experience point of view. I think that that's way it's overvaluated. It isn't that it's not a useful tool, but it isn't the only tool. And I think other models should be developed that deal with the data and have questionnaires that can confirm those hypotheses, which would take which would take another perspective on the psychological effects which are necessary for healing, the subjective experiences which are required for healing. I think other ones are. So like, in my lecture, I talked about this Canadian study. They believe that, DTs, when you bottom out on the DTs, you'll stop drinking because that's true frequently. And, the confusional, crazy, weird state on LSD, they said, oh, that's like DT. Maybe if we give LSD, it'll mimic the DT, and then people will stop drinking. And they stopped drinking, or at least a fair number did. So you could develop a DT rating scale, and you could give it, and you could perhaps establish that symptoms like the DTs are also effective in reducing drinking or end-of-life despair.
Definitely. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess brings me to another question about, there are so many pieces of research that we still need to see from this ecosystem, not only on the science side, but also in terms of, how do we create greater access? What are some of the best models for, clinics or for, actually bringing this to market in the safest way possible. So there's research kind of on the economic, on the sociological, anthropological, sides as well. I was wondering your thoughts on having is it time for us to be building out the research infrastructure specifically for psychedelics, in a broader sense? So, having things like a peer-reviewed journal that focuses specifically on everything psychedelic, but not just the science, all of the other components of kind of bringing this to humanity.
When you were talking, I kept on thinking, this is all contingent on the drug not being criminalized horribly again. There not being some new prohibition. Where the government said, okay, we changed our mind. Stop giving people these drugs, or plants, or whatever. So that's the most important thing, is to keep the momentum and to not make any mistakes. Let's not shoot ourselves in the feet or the foot. That being the case, there are all kinds of ways to utilize psychedelic states for the good. So it could be in clinics, it could be at centers, new religions, or combining old religions with new sacraments, summer camp. There's all kinds of ways that you can start integrating states into the larger culture for good. But that is contingent, like I said, on keeping channels open.
Definitely. You mentioned, something like summer camp. Was wondering, one of the things that came up in this conference was quite a bit was education and how we kind of educate individuals on all of this. What are some of your thoughts on, how we can revise programs like DARE and that have kind of been foundational in drug education, especially in the US, to allow for them to actually include a healthier conversation about psychedelics, especially with some of your concerns about them not necessarily having this, end goal point that people can be brought to, but instead oftentimes emphasizing pieces of an individual's subconscious?
Well, it would require getting people to program those programs, who know what they're talking about. So that's a pitch to work for the government, work for the FDA, work for the DEA, or if the resistance is too great, you can then start your own drug education programs. There are programs like that, dance safe, for example. So they could try to infiltrate or get themselves integrated into the larger educational.
Definitely, yeah. We had Maddie on from DanceSafe a few days ago, and it's a conversation that we want to continue having with her as well. I'd really love to hear also, as we're approaching the end of time, what role do you see yourself playing over these next 10 years in this ecosystem? How do you want to either contribute or step away? What do you want your role to be in everything that's unfolding forward?
Well, I would like to still be involved. I've been involved. I mean, I kind of got out after the study ended. I moved to Canada, and I had all kinds of things happen. But once I got my feedback on the ground, it was there was I stopped my studies toward the end of 1995, and then just started doing clinical work, community mental health centers, private practice, psychiatry. So it was as if nobody knew who I was, and I just wasn't paying attention to it. But then I kind of woke up at a certain point and looked around, and there still was much research going on. 2005 was when the first Hopkin paper came out. There was a small study from Arizona giving psilocybin to cases of OCD. But there wasn't really that much going on for the next 10 years. So I figured, well, I can still contribute, and began getting more involved. I do quite a few interviews. I still write. The DMT book has done great. It's sold a lot of copies, and the movie, and the prophetic state book that came out in 2014, continues to sell, and I think has some good ideas in there, regarding the psychedelic state and the prophetic state, which I think may take a lot longer to catch on than using psychedelics in practice. I edit or my review papers, for consideration of publication in scientific journals. I've got some students that I mentor. I've done a couple of I've done a couple of consultations with big pharma, which is interesting. The kinds of questions that they ask, but because of your confidentiality, I can't actually say, but they're keenly interested in the psychedelic space, but they just don't know quite how to proceed. So that's one of the things I can help them with. And kind of as a role model, I guess. I live in Gallup, New Mexico, in the middle of nowhere, where the Navajo are being decimated by COVID. And I just live by myself, like in a big, comfortable house with a lot of books. So I try to stay out of harm's way, and I do try to contribute to the greater good in my own way. So that's kind of role modeling. Last year I wrote a novel, a semi-autobiographical novel on a year of illness and recuperation that I went through about 6 years ago. Joseph Levy escaped death. So that's been fun. It's me knocking myself off the pedestal, which can happen. If you're a Pied Piper, people follow you and they think you can't be wrong. So like I react to that. I don't really like that. I like people to see who I am. So that was one of the reasons that I wrote that novel. So hopefully I'll be around in 10 years. I hike, and I really live in a beautiful spot. So it's to say.
Definitely. Two more questions before we go. One of them What are the types of collaborations that you're looking forward to? I mean, you mentioned, specifically kind of this umbrella of pharmaceutical companies. Are there any specific individuals or groups that you would really love to be working with over the next few years?
Any groups?
Yeah, or individual researchers.
Yeah, individual researchers. Well, there is a fellow in Israel, Ido Hartogsen, who got me thinking about psychedelics as a super placebo. He worked in Israel for a while, did a postdoc at Harvard, and went back to Israel. So I don't think he's working in the placebo field anymore, although I wish he would, because I think using psychedelics as keys to unlocking the placebo effect, I think, any real creative development in the field. There was a group in Montreal that just published a paper, where you could give people placebo, and then bring other people in the room who are pretending to trip, and the people that got placebo thought they were given a psychedelic drug. So I think there's some interesting work that could be kind of piggybacked onto that group study. Like for example, if you gave a tiny dose of a psychedelic to your experimental group, would the fake trippers influence them even more? Or if you gave the people that were pretending to be on psychedelics a small amount of the psychedelic, would that influence your experimental group even more? I think the confluence of suggestibility, hypnotizability, and placebo are going to be the new frontiers when it comes to psychedelic research.
Very interesting. And if folks are looking to contribute to your work, to your mission, everything that you're doing, how can they do so? Is there a website that you would suggest them visiting, reaching out to you? What would be the best way for folks to get involved with your work?
Yeah, so I've got my own website with Strassman.com, and I pretty much respond to every email, and there's a contact link there. And I have a couple pages on Facebook, my public page and a personal page, and I respond to emails that are posted there too.
Beautiful. Well, Rick, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciated your insights in the conversation. Incredible stuff. So thank you so much for taking the time and coming on.
Well, sure. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Be well, Rick. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye.